Why do people who secretly hate their boss make Freudian slips, calling their boss dear when they meant to say sir? Why do people who are rageful become vocally committed to nonviolence? Why do people forget traumatic events until something brings them back? Freud's answer: the unconscious mind is constantly working to protect us from truths we cannot bear to face. Freud proposed that the mind has three structures in perpetual conflict. The ID is the most primitive, existing entirely in the unconscious and operating on the pleasure principle, seeking the immediate discharge of tension through gratification of instinctual drives. The ID is present at birth, immoral, illogical, and recognizes no distinction between fantasy and reality. When an infant cries for milk or comfort without any understanding of timing or consequences, that is the ID in its purest form. The ego develops out of the ID through contact with reality and operates on the reality principle, finding acceptable ways to satisfy ID drives that are realistic and socially viable. The ego is largely conscious, though portions of it operate outside awareness, and it is the executive center of the personality. It mediates between the raw demands of the ID, the moral prohibitions of the superego, and the constraints of external reality. The ego delays gratification, plans, problem solves, and employs defense mechanisms to manage anxiety. The superego develops around age 4 through 6, as children internalize the moral standards and prohibitions of their parents and culture. It has two parts: the conscience, which generates guilt when moral standards are violated, and the ego ideal, which generates pride when one lives up to internalized standards of excellence. The superego operates both consciously, as deliberate moral reasoning, and unconsciously, as automatic guilt and shame responses that can be disproportionate to the actual transgression. Repression is Freud's foundational defense mechanism, the motivated, unconscious exclusion of threatening material from conscious awareness. Unlike ordinary forgetting, repression is not passive decay, but an active process that keeps anxiety-producing content hidden. Freud argued that repressed material does not disappear, but continues to influence behavior from the unconscious, emerging as symptoms, dreams, and slips of the tongue. The scientific evidence for repression as a mechanism distinct from ordinary forgetting remains controversial, though traumatic memory research continues to be active. Rationalization involves generating plausible but false explanations for behavior that was actually driven by unacceptable motives. When someone does not get the job they wanted and announces that they never really wanted it anyway, that is rationalization, and also an example of what Leon Festinger would later call cognitive dissonance reduction. Rationalization protects the ego from having to acknowledge unflattering truths about one's motivations, competence, or behavior. Because the person genuinely believes the rationalization, it is distinct from ordinary lying. Projection involves unconsciously attributing one's own unacceptable impulses, thoughts, or feelings to another person. The individual who is unconsciously angry at a friend may become convinced that the friend is angry at them. Someone who has unconscious homosexual impulses that conflict with their self-concept may become intensely preoccupied with the perceived homosexuality of others. Research by Newman, Duff, and Baumeister found experimental evidence for projection. People who suppressed a trait they found unacceptable in themselves were more likely to see that trait in ambiguous others. Reaction formation involves converting an unacceptable impulse into its opposite, not just controlling it, but actively expressing the reverse. A person who harbors unconscious hatred may become excessively affectionate. Someone with repressed aggressive impulses may become an outspoken pacifist. The telltale sign of reaction formation, as opposed to genuinely holding the expressed position, is the exaggerated intensity of the opposite behavior. The loudest advocates against a behavior are sometimes struggling with it most intensely themselves. Displacement occurs when an impulse or emotion, most often aggression or desire, is redirected from its original, threatening target to a safer substitute. The classic example: you are humiliated by your boss, but cannot express anger at them without risking your job. So you come home and snap at your spouse or kick the dog. The anger is real, only the target has changed. Displacement underlies scapegoating at the societal level. Outgroup members become targets for frustrations that cannot be safely directed at authority. Psychoanalytic theory faces a fundamental scientific challenge. It is structured in ways that make it extraordinarily difficult to falsify. If a person denies having the impulses Freud claims they have, the denial itself can be interpreted as evidence of repression. If they express the opposite impulse, that is reaction formation. If they express it, that confirms the original hypothesis. This irrefutability is a scientific liability, not an asset. Karl Popper argued that psychoanalysis was a pseudoscience precisely because it could accommodate any possible outcome. Despite its overall poor scientific track record, some psychoanalytic concepts have received empirical support. Research on unconscious priming demonstrates that non-conscious processes influence behavior in ways consistent with Freud's broad claim that the unconscious is active. The experimental work on projection mentioned earlier offers support for at least one specific mechanism. And ego depletion research is consistent with the idea that self-regulation is a limited resource that can be exhausted, analogous to the ego's struggle to contain ID impulses. The baby was not entirely thrown out with the bathwater. Freud's greatest contribution may not be his specific theories, but his insistence that we are not fully transparent to ourselves, that motives operate outside conscious awareness, and that what we say we feel is not always what we are actually experiencing. Modern cognitive science has vindicated this broad insight while rejecting many of the specific mechanisms Freud proposed.